Oh man, you saw us here a few weeks ago or something?
Yeah, no, I talked to you guys a couple of weeks ago and had a good time, so I thought I'd come out here again.
Awesome.
When I saw you guys out here.
Want to borrow this or no?
Let me see if it helps.
Does it help?
Yeah, that helps me a lot, actually.
It is going down.
Yeah. There we go. Okay.
Should we move?
Perhaps, yeah.
Oh, or is it just? How close are we? We can just hang out for like 2 minutes.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm sure it'll be gone in like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Anyway, what did we talk about before? Do you remember?
I think last time the subject was, should we believe things that are false? That was one of them. It was very epistemological.
Oh yeah, I think you talked with David about that.
Yeah, I talked to another guy. It could have been David.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, should we believe things because they're true or something? Or should we care about truth? Those types of things?
Yeah. Something like that.
Yeah, that was one of the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see the topics today?
Yeah, no, I saw them. I saw Kyle Rittenhouse. You had critical race theory, inflation, vaccine mandates, all very timely topics.
Yeah.
All good topics. I don't know. I feel like I haven't really talked about it too much, but I feel like it's not, exclusive to the last couple of months, but kind of over the last year, I feel like critical race theory has been, hotly debated. I feel like it's kind of unnecessary for it to be so controversial, but I think it takes up a lot of real estate in our minds, and I feel like culturally, it's a really big social issue right now, so I think I'd be interested to talk about that.
Be glad to talk about that.
Yeah.
Can you do headphones?
Yeah, let's do it. It's better.
It's better, yeah. Great.
Cool.
Tell me the hat.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
I'll wear it because my hair. Hat here. Can I get your first name?
Yeah, my first name is Riley.
Riley, that was right. My name is Reed.
Reed, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, so CRT, critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
Hot button issue.
Yeah.
What's a good question to focus on for this in general? Like, there's this question, should CRT be taught in schools? Is it being taught in schools like universities or K through 12? Is it just a legal theory? Is it Marxist? Is it racist? Is it a good thing in general? What's the question we should focus on?
I think if we say CRT is a good thing in general, then it necessarily follows that it should be taught in K through 12 schools, and it should be normalized. But I feel like the most important issue when people talk about CRT is oftentimes people are talking past each other because we don't even define what CRT even is, from the get-go.
Yeah. So, the question is CRT a good thing?
Mm-hmm.
And what is CRT? What is
right. To me, CRT, it's kind of a broad theory. I'd roughly describe it as, I'd say it has a few key tenets. One of them is critically and honestly discussing the relationship with America's history and the relationship and the original sin of slavery, as well as soberly talking about the corresponding consequences of slavery and segregation and how that still is very relevant today, and how that historical and material background creates serious examples of systemic racism and systemic disadvantages. That is to say that there's disadvantages that Black people face, and it's not due to individual choices, it's not due to something on a very small level, but it's because of institutions and historical mechanisms that have deprived them of many things that other people have greater access to.
Okay. try to recap that without looking at that. Yeah, it's about focusing on the original sin of slavery and all and all of the segregation in America's past, and the negative effects of that over time and what has been left over today. And that is not about individual attitudes or beliefs. It's more about systemic issues, systemic racism, stuff coming from potentially, structures like that, institutions. That's what critical race theory is focusing on. It's wanting to help fix racism, and a specific kind of racism, systemic racism. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair summary of what I said.
Okay. And fixing that is a good thing. If CRT is trying to do that, then it's a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's a good thing to fix systemic racism.
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's gonna fix it. You could say one of the goals of it is to make people cognizant of it so we're better able to fix it. But I'd say it's ultimately about education, and it's ultimately about making people more aware of that rather than pursuing, actual policy that will ameliorate these issues.
Yeah, people are aware of the regular version of racism, like the attitude, like thinking someone is worse than because of their skin color, or privileging them on that.
I think I'd say what all this means is that CRT is a way to not whitewash and undervalue the role that many racist structures played in American history.
Not whitewash, not like cover up or excuse certain things.
Absolutely not do that. But I'd say most history books cover that. But what CRT does is it tries to ensure that when we talk about these really unfortunate chapters, that the history of it and the repercussions of it aren't minimized, if that makes sense.
Make sure the repercussions of it, the effects of it, those past policies are not being brushed over.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And CRT wants to raise awareness about that and make sure that's part of the history curriculum.
Correct, yeah.
And if that gets in there, then we'll be more likely to solve the systemic racism problem.
I think it will help us, but it won't go nearly far enough. I think there's a huge difference between that and actual policy, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, what is CRT pushing to change? Like, what are some of its policies, or what does it want to change in America? What is its goals?
Yeah, well, I think the reason when we talk about CRT, I think the reason why it's such a controversial topic, you could say, I frankly don't think it's very controversial or should be, is that it's received excessive backlash from the right. I think it's become a huge cultural issue that doesn't need to be kind of like Black Lives Matter. For example, I think CRT, it's based on a few scholars, but it's kind of the theory of looking at American history through a more critical lens that way that might not be favorable to narratives of American exceptionalism.
Critical lens, critical race theory uses a critical lens, and what does the critical mean in that critical lens?
It means that if the evidence takes you there, it's more willing to scrutinize American history, and it's more likely to portray a narrative that America was founded on several examples of oppression, and that's what it's founded on, rather than a rejection of oppression. And it's founded on the oppression and exploitation of other people rather than being a paragon of freedom and liberty.
CRT values the objective evidence of history
Yes.
and objectivity in general.
I'd say it values that rather than painting a rosy picture of American history that will make people feel good.
Okay. Where should we go now? Anything else to define about, like, the goals of it? What is its vision of society in the future? What would it like to get to?
Yeah, well, I can't speak for every scholar of CRT
Yeah.
and, all the founders of the ideology, because if you think about it, it sort of just is a commitment to looking at history with two assumptions: an emphasis towards social justice, and two, valuing evidence and what actually happened. So I think you asked me where CRT is trying to go.
Yeah.
I think it's trying to go to a place where we view American history differently, and a place where we understand that American history and the freedom and rights that many people gained, and the development of American hegemony was based on taking that right and many of those freedoms away from other people that way.
So the freedom that America enjoys was taken from people like the indigenous Americans and black people?
Yeah, I'd say CRT talks mostly about the history of black people,
Black peoples.
but I'm not sure. I frankly wouldn't be surprised, and I think, it's also extremely important to talk about the genocide of the Native Americans as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll ask this clarifying question.
Sure.
For its vision of society in the future, at some point, does it want to get to a more colorblind society? You didn't mention that word, I'm just saying it. Or does it want to be a more race-conscious society?
That's a good question. I frankly, I'm not sure, because I feel like ideally, we recognize that race is not a biologically meaningful construct in any way. It's really something that does not exist on a biological level. So in that way, in principle, I think that, at least for me, it would be great to live in a world where it is colorblind, but I feel like to get there, you need to rectify, previous sins, because there's so many people that are disadvantaged at this point, and the best way to correct that is by being race conscious.
We'll get to a colorblind society by using a kind of race consciousness to eventually get there as the goal.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. What about this principle? These two sets of principles.
Sure.
The remedy to past injustice is present. The remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. And the remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. What about, and I can explain the context of that, those principles. Is that a CRT principle? Have you heard of those?
Yeah, so, you could say that's basically the idea of reparations. Now, the thing is, with reparations, is I understand how that's technically discrimination, but I feel like in many ways that's necessary in order to actually equalize the playing field, because you're saying, this isn't a perfect analogy, but let's say there's a race and somebody is running, you start at the same place, then you hit them with a club or something like that, and then you're way ahead of them. To not be in favor of reparations, or to not be in favor of having people that have a fair playing field, would be like, all right, too bad, I know I did that in the past, but it would be wrong to disadvantage the person ahead in order to advance the person that's behind. But I personally believe that actually the best way to achieve more what you would call economic egalitarianism would be through reparations on the basis of class and several other social programs that way, which will disproportionately benefit people that tend to be Black and Latino that have been historically disadvantaged because of the legacy of slavery and apartheid.
Gotcha. And you mentioned the race analogy. I'm trying to get a scale here. So if like this is the start line, I want to quantify the level of like racism in society, or the level of like the race analogy is about group differences and where they are, right? Like there's the average place in society of white people and of Black people and Asians. Right now, white people are ahead of Black people in like outcomes that we care about. How much is that gap, and what caused that gap? And do we want to close that gap? Is that what CRT is wanting to do? To close the gaps of the of outcomes of racial groups?
Mm-hmm. I think the best way to measure it is, not, for example, conducting a Pew poll, I should say, where we measure racial biases. I think the best way and what determines attitudes and ideas is material circumstances. So if we look at the Black to white wealth gap, for example, I bet it's higher, but I know that the average white family has at least 8 times as much net worth as the average Black family. So in that way, we can see that white people are very, very advantaged in society that way. So we see a massive disparity that way. I think another example of what we can talk about is the treatment from police officers. For example, there's a famous study, white and Black people consume weed at the same rate, but despite this, Black people are 4 times more likely to be incarcerated. Or the fact that white and Black people commit murder at the same rate, or they commit crimes that are deemed by the legal system to be worthy of capital punishment at the same rate, but despite that, Black people are again far more likely to receive the death penalty, which I disagree with in general, but I think we see that's a huge example of racial bias that's not just on the individual level, but something that's on the institutional level. So I think if we're trying to quantify it, I think it's hard to underestimate the difference between Black and white leverage in the American political system.
Gotcha. Yeah, so if CRT's goal is to remedy kind of past injustice of racism in America, it wants to raise consciousness about these issues in order to help solve them. And what are some of the things that it's saying could solve it? What's the top thing?
Mm-hmm. I think, because to me, based on my understanding of CRT, I haven't read extensively about CRT like I have on other things, but I think I don't know if CRT is necessarily proposing a solution. I think rather the primary objective of it is to raise awareness, because in California it's true to an extent, but in other states people seldom talk about the actual impacts that historical oppression has now. But I'd say in order to solve many of these issues, what I would be in favor of personally is to begin a more robust welfare state, universal health care, and what you could say are kind of analogous to maybe New Deal policies, But in general, I think a long-term solution is believing in economic democracy and economic egalitarianism, which means attacking capitalism in general, because I fundamentally believe that racial disparities are based on the way that capitalism works. So I think the long-term solution is building socialism.
The long-term solution is socialism and attacking capitalism.
Yes.
Ideally get to a socialist state,
Yes.
which would be, what would that look like?
I think when I talk about socialism, it's really become a pejorative word. I think that there's really been a war on anything left of center, or what I would say left of, American neoliberalism. So in that way, what I'd say is that a more socialist, egalitarian society is based on economic democracy, which is a world in which the workers and the laborers have greater autonomy over their life, and they have democracy that extends not just to the political system, but also the economic system, where they own the means of production rather than the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie or the CEOs and shareholders. So we see economic power distributed far more evenly that way. So we could talk about it for hours, but that's my 1-minute pitch of what it would look like.
Giving workers more autonomy, not only in political systems, but economic systems.
Absolutely, yeah.
So when they go to work, whatever job they go to, they have like part ownership in the company? How
Yeah,
does that work?
that's what I'd want to encourage. It depends on the company, but broadly speaking, I'd want them to have a greater share.
There's not like
and
a board
ownership
of
in the
directors who are like controlling the company's stuff. It's like they vote on whatever they need to do or stuff like that?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay. Gotcha. What about private property in that world? Is that a thing or not a thing?
So I feel like people get tripped up on this, and we need to be very specific about what we mean by private property. I fundamentally believe that what gives people the right to own something is labor. So in that way, I think when we talk about, private property, if a capitalist owns a plant or a factory or something like that, it's private because it's private to them, but the workers don't have any ownership of it, so it's privacy that way through exclusion. So in that way, in the economic domain, I'd want to see more communal property. I would want to see less walls against everybody owning the fruits of their labor. So in that way, I'd want to see a shift where there's less private property that way. But I think in terms of what people buy with their, where they live and different things like that, I believe that they have the right to their own property.
Property is gained through labor in this world. Is that fair?
I'd say so, yeah.
Okay. That's very different from today.
Absolutely.
How does that transition work? Is there a point where private property becomes illegal, or is it always legal? It's just people go through that norm. They believe in that principle more, and they're following that principle, or is it illegal in this society?
Well, here's where I feel like many people, I'm not saying you, of course, have a misconception about what I mean, because I don't just want the government to make things illegal. Everybody thinks, socialism is when the government's big. It's when the government decides to expropriate everything and takes things away from you. No, I'm not talking about that. To me, it's not about state power. The same way I reject state autocracy is the same way I reject capitalist autocracy that way. What I fundamentally believe is I want workers to work together, and through mass collective action and mobilization that way, in a system that is not done exclusively through the state but through true democracy, is where people will voluntarily decide and learn about the benefits through doing it, which many studies support, of worker cooperatives. So I want people to work collectively in order to, pursue these goals.
So it'll be a class consciousness type thing. Once people get enough of that, they'll just freely choose that.
Precisely.
And then once there's enough people doing it, it'll be an easy switch.
Yeah, I think when we see more people doing it, people will be more inclined to do it. There's a firm in Spain that did it. It's one of the 5 largest companies in Spain, I believe. It's called Mondragon, and it's had great success doing it. So I think when more people start doing that and they understand the benefits and how it's categorically different and how, they have a better day at work, they get paid more, they feel more fulfilled and less alienated, then I think that will encourage the transition. But at the same time, it's not going to be nearly as seamless as that. I think there's going to be plenty of resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we see more companies like Mondragon working and becoming successful and people being really happy in that situation, that would be evidence. Good reason to think this is a good way to go in the future?
Absolutely, yes. Okay.
How would Mondragon need to work out or be in the future to potentially change your confidence about that?
What do you mean?
What's a good way to figure out if this is actually a good system to use?
I think
if we're using Mondragon as an example, what would need to happen to Mondragon in order to potentially start changing our mind about that?
Sure. So I think, wait, are you saying to change my mind where I view what I'm talking about in a less favorable light?
Or more favorable. What's a good metric to use to think this is a good way to go?
Yeah, so I think there's certain metrics that are pretty basic but reflect success. I think there's one company in the U.S., you might have seen him, he's become fairly famous recently. His name is Dan Price, and he's the CEO of this startup company. And essentially what he did was he was making millions and millions of dollars, but instead he said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to sacrifice a bit of the excessive capital I make and give each of my workers a $70,000 minimum wage to work at this place. And what he found was stunning. Over the next couple of years, worker productivity increased dramatically because they had, more of an incentive to actually be proud of what they created. And then something else that conservatives claim to actually value, but when it comes down to the economic forces that actually make a world conducive to these things, is that there were way more people in his company taking time off and having kids and having families, which is what I thought was a wonderful thing. So you can talk about that. I think, productivity does matter in a company. So I think increased productivity is a great example. Increase of wages, therefore people have more buying power, they can stimulate the economy, they can purchase more goods and services, having more time off, I think, and having more economic freedom through that to actually raise a family. So I think there's many more metrics we can talk about, but I think those 3 are great starting points.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, we've kind of gone on a tangent from CRT.
Sure, yeah. I don't mind.
But socialism's a good topic as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've heard a lot of reasons so far. Yeah, we can just keep going. You said, well, you've been here before, so you know where we are.
Yeah.
We'll try to be here on Wednesdays.
All right. Wonderful.
And, thank you so much, Riley.
Yeah, thank you.
This was fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed this. Yeah, you guys are going to be here every Wednesday?
Try to be, yeah.
All right, wonderful. Just like all day?
11 to 3 or so.
11 to 3, something like that? Yeah. All right, I apprate it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Did you get a puzzle piece last time?
Yeah, I did, but I'll take another one so I connect the puzzle.
What color would you want this time?
Red.
All right, go. Feel free.
Sure.
Love it.
Awesome. Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
This is fun. Thanks.
On Twitch, right?
Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter.
Gotcha.
I'll have a clip on my second YouTube channel,
Okay, what's your second YouTube channel?
Cordial Curiosity Clips.
Okay, gotcha.
I'll have that tomorrow or so.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.